a peculiar concrete box overlooking the coast of China.
It looks like a speaker, only it is the size of a building.
In Scotland, the windswept remnants of a seafaring people.
These men were a special breed of professional plunderers.
An unassuming Swiss village with a covert purpose.
This is not your average bucolic Swiss pasture. This is a killing field.
And an epic Alaskan venture that led to fame and fortune.
They were celebrities and incredibly famous in American culture, and they were controversial at times.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. On the coast of a tiny island just a few miles from mainland China, a bizarre block looms over the shoreline.
One of the strangest things on the island is this weird concrete box. It almost looks like an office building.
What appear to be windows in an apartment block are not windows at all. They're little circular openings, almost like a speaker on a radio.
Structures littering a nearby beach might offer a clue to its purpose.
There's rusty pieces of metal sticking out of the beach, and there's various odd structures sticking out of the ground here and there.
Someone has clearly invested a great deal in making it very hard to land on this shore.
But not all of the defenses here are immediately visible.
There's a huge underground complex carved into one of these mountains. There are tunnels here that are big enough to drive a truck through. This wasn't some little hideaway. This was a serious underground base. As small and insignificant as it appears today, this island came very close to triggering a nuclear war.
Yang Xiron grew up here and remembers a time when this beach was strictly out of bounds.
另外海边，以前我们海边是不能下海的，我们不能靠海边。我们现在四面环海，但是我们很少见到海。
This is Kinman Island. Within sight of neighboring China, this territory actually belongs to another country, Taiwan.
但是以现在来讲，我是觉得，金门人他比较能了解台湾，也能了解大陆，所以金门人是作为台湾跟大陆的一个沟通的一个桥梁，是非常好的。
This unique understanding was born out of the Chinese Civil War, which came to a head in 1949.
Mao totally defeats the nationalist forces and drives them out of China and onto the island of Taiwan, where they exist to this day as the Republic of China.
Chairman Mao's communists, the People's Liberation Army, had ousted the nationalists led by General Chiang Kai-shek.
Mao Zedong seats himself in power in mainland China, and the previous government of China under Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist movement flees to the island of Taiwan. But they don't only take the island of Taiwan, they take this little island group directly off the coast of China.
The biggest island of the group is Kinmen, just 4 miles from the mainland.
There's no way that the communists wanted to tolerate what they saw as subversives right off their coast. And in 1949, Mao's forces attacked Kinman Island.
But the defenses that can be seen here today show the nationalists were expecting them.
There's a 56-hour battle for Kinmen as amphibious Chinese communist forces land on Kinmen and try to wrest it from its nationalist defenders.
Bullet-ridden buildings, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting.
当时就是解放军他在里面，那指挥总部。
Yet Mao's Communist Army wasn't up to the challenge of taking Kinmen from the nationalists.
They establish a beachhead, but they cannot break out onto the rest of the island. They didn't have the technical capability to put a big enough force on shore.
Those that did make it onto the beaches were met with mines, bunkers, and obstacles, all backed up by a force far larger than they expected.
Using these beach obstacles, using these defenses, Chiang Kai-shek pushes them back into the sea.
For Mao, it was a disaster. 9,000 communist soldiers stormed ashore. The majority were killed or taken prisoner.
当时这里尸野遍地，惨不忍睹了。
The Republic of China forces were able to repel the attack, but it wouldn't be the last time they came under fire.
Separated by only a few miles of water, the islanders knew it was just a matter of time.
到大陆，而且很近哦，天气好的时候非常清楚。来，我们那个方向，那个地方就是。
The Taiwanese build up Kinmen as a major defensive bastion. They honeycomb all the cliffs and hills with bunkers, and they make this a much more defensible place.
The Cold War was now running hot throughout East Asia, and Kinman Island found itself on the front line.
We saw Korea falling to the communists, Indochina falling to the communists, all of China falling to the communists. The US felt that it was losing this battle of containment and that something had to be done.
US President Dwight Eisenhower, fearing a domino effect of nations falling to communism, offered protection to the Chinese nationalists on Taiwan and Kinmen.
In 1954, there's a major international crisis when Mao Zedong bombards Kinmen and the neighboring islands with artillery, forcing the United States to tell the communists to cease and desist. There's a second crisis in 1958, much bigger one.
Mainland China really unloaded on Kinmen Island. They launched an artillery barrage that went on day and night and just didn't stop.
Over 44 days, the People's Liberation Army would deliver 470,000 artillery rounds.
当时就是金门都在大陆的炮火那个范围内，所以整个金门是非常惨烈的啊。那甚至波及的非常多的民房，尤其在炮阵地，只要是属于这种炮阵地附近，几乎我们可以用焦土整个列为焦土被炸为焦土来形容。
It seemed only a matter of time before the nationalists would have to evacuate Kinmen.
The big question in the mind of everyone in China, everyone on Taiwan, and even back in Moscow is what is Washington going to do?
In the US at one point, the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended considering nuclear weapons to stop China's aggression. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed.
Eisenhower resisted calls for a nuclear strike. Instead, he combined a show of naval strength with a supply of military hardware.
The United States started to give heavy howitzers. A howitzer is an artillery piece that's able to fire at a high angle. It's able to throw its shells up high in the air over a long distance.
These behemoths could fire huge shells over 10 miles, making them a formidable problem for the communists. And Kinmen's underground bases provided the ideal location.
因为这个炮法是在我们这个花岗岩层底下开挖的。 那所以它相对的安全，像这么重的炮堡，他们反击的时候只是炸到上面的花岗岩，所以对，这门炮就可以安全的放置于这里，继续反击。
These guns made it possible for the forces on Kinmen Island to return fire. They were able to start shelling the mainland.
因为有这些炮。 反击过去，那使得大陆开始害怕，因为我们的火力就增强了。
This initiated a curious ritual.
On alternate days, the gunners on each side would prepare their guns, load them up, and bombard the other side while the other side kept their heads down.
While this bizarre artillery duel continued, the Cold War was evolving.
Part of the continued conflict was a propaganda war, and that entailed a secret weapon on the island.
好，来，我们现在所在的位置是在金门的西北角，啊，那距离现在我们直线距离，大陆最近的距离，大登岛6400公尺左右，哦，6.4公里。那这一栋建筑叫北山播音墙，它的主要功能，哦，在当时是心战喊话，对大陆居民，哦，那喊话，应该说对大陆喊话，哦，对大陆喊话。
Built in 1967, this was the last of 5 broadcasting walls erected on Kinmen.
The Chinese nationalists realized that the communist projects had killed a lot of people in China, had made a lot of people hostile to the government in Beijing. And so the nationalists decided to start beaming propaganda at the communist population on the mainland.
It said this speaker was so loud it could be heard 15 miles inland on the mainland.
好，早期的音乐呢，早期的广播呢是心战喊话，哦，那根据我们的田野调查，就心战喊话里面它会夹杂一些，类似密码，哦，比如说我们潜伏到大陆的这些，军人呢，那到哪边集合，或是执行什么任务，都会在里面，对，有提示。
Over time, the speaker was used not just for political, but cultural warfare.
The speaker tower would blast out songs from popular Taiwanese singers and ear-splitting anti-communist propaganda.
By the late 1970s, improving relations between the United States, China, and Taiwan meant the guns, propaganda, and music finally fell silent. Today, a ferry service runs between Taiwanese Kinmen and the Chinese mainland, but tensions in the region remain.
Officially, our support for Taiwan is known as strategic ambiguity. In other words, neither Taiwan nor China really knows whether we would come to Taiwan's defense, but so far China has not wanted to push its luck.
Deep in the Alaskan mountains is a pioneering relic from America's past.
This area really is remote. It's a good couple of days away from any major towns.
This setting is just epic. You've got these beautiful mountain peaks, an enormous glacier.
Breaking up this rugged scene is a collection of red buildings tumbling down the hillside.
Everywhere you look, you see the ruins of industrial equipment. You see cables and chains and broken down machinery.
You realize this is 14 stories high. This is on a big scale.
You can imagine living up here if you were a tough pioneer type, but it is not an easy place to live.
2 of America's best-known names made their fortunes here. But prospecting in this wilderness wasn't for the faint-hearted. Kyle Thilbert is an alpine guide and well used to exploring these ghostly ruins alone.
It can get a little spooky at times walking through some of these old abandoned buildings and knowing that you are the only person, but you still hear things. You know, those buildings are starting to fall apart. They're definitely not quite safe enough for us to go into.
Yet some areas are still accessible and display the remnants of a fully fledged town.
This building here is the post office and warehouse. They had mail that was delivered to this building here, sorted and distributed throughout town.
These are the remains of a town once known as Kennicott.
Because this town is so remote, they had to be fully self-sufficient. You can imagine everything from food to parts to clothing. At its peak, Kennicott had about 550 men on payroll.
So what was it that drew this many people to such a remote outpost? In 1900, two men, Tarantula Jack Smith and Clarence L. Warner, made a discovery that spawned a legend.
They stopped for lunch and looked across the valley, and they saw this green patch, and one of them said, oh, that might be good for sheep.
They scrambled up the side of the mountain, and what they thought was green vegetation actually turned out to be green rocks.
It is still credited as one of the richest deposits ever discovered in the world.
They've made the Bonanza discovery.
It's a bonanza, with the words Smith and Warner supposedly exclaimed upon their discovery of copper ore.
Copper was becoming a very, very valuable commodity. With the advent of electricity, copper was in high demand.
Getting it out of the ground, though, in this unforgiving landscape was no mean feat.
They needed investors with very deep pockets, and they found them. In 1905, a group called the Alaska Syndicate was formed, and its members included two of the richest and most famous bankers in the world, the Guggenheim brothers and J.P. Morgan. They pooled their vast resources to begin the process of developing the mines.
Soon, the Bonanza mine was connected to a processing mill, and the Kennicott copper mine was in full operation.
So these cables here you see run about 4.5 miles up the ridge line behind us to the mines themselves. Bringing those buckets loaded with 500 to 600 pounds of copper ore, you would have one bucket coming down these lines every 52 seconds. So in less than a minute, you'd have to be able to dump that ore, get it back on the line in just enough time to catch the next one as it came off.
From here, the ore needed to be sorted, and this is where the vast height and slope of the building came in.
You put the ore at the top, you crush the big pieces, and then you let gravity carry it down level by level, one crushing machine to another, until it's reduced to a fine sand.
When this building was in operation, the noise here would have been deafening. There was lots of equipment, crushers, different machinery that was separating out that copper ore.
But excavating and processing the ore wasn't the biggest challenge facing the Alaska Syndicate.
There was no railroad at that time, but the buildings and everything were operating before that railroad came in, so all that equipment was brought in by hand, essentially. We're just under 200 miles to the coast from here, so you can imagine trying to bring all that equipment in by either dog sled, pack horses. It's amazing that they could even get that here.
Guggenheim and Morgan desperately needed a railroad to get the copper to market.
They didn't start construction on the railroad till 1907. Part of that was they couldn't actually find anybody to build it. Nothing of this scale or this terrain had ever been done before.
It was a monumental engineering challenge, and its pinnacle was how to cross the mighty Copper River.
If your idea of a river is something like the rivers you see in most parts of the world, you have no idea what rivers in Alaska are like.
The most infamous crossing was just below the Miles Glacier.
So this glacier was not only dumping out millions and millions of gallons of water, but in the warmer seasons, it was dropping huge icebergs into the river that would then flow down.
Now, if one of those hits a pier, which is supporting the trusses, your whole bridge comes down.
So to build that was almost impossible, really, by those standards at the time. They didn't think it could be done. It costed well over $1 million to build that one bridge alone.
Yet, the $1 million bridge, as it was famously coined, was just a fraction of the overall cost of building the railroad. The Alaska Syndicate thought it worth the investment, but they weren't alone.
While the Alaska Syndicate is busy building their own route up to their mines, there was another group that claimed to have rights to also build a route. It got very heated. It turned out that the syndicate, they didn't want anybody else building a railroad line. They were armed. They wanted to keep them out. One member of the syndicate crew hid behind a boulder and really, like a sniper, he shot 3 men from the other team.
Dubbed the Keystone Canyon Affair, it made national headlines.
J.P. Morgan and the Guggenheim brothers were incredibly famous in American culture. I mean, today, you'd almost look at somebody like a Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk. They were celebrities, and it was a huge scandal, legitimately. It was cold-blooded murder. And in Alaska, the syndicate was viewed very suspiciously from that point on.
Yet this scandal didn't stop them. Having fended off the competition and completed the railroad, it seemed that nothing could stand in the way of Guggenheim and Morgan.
When the railroad came in 1911, they had enough ore stocked up so they could fill that very first train, send it out with $250,000 worth of copper ore.
The mine was running as one of the most profitable in the world.
So this building here was the ammonia leaching plant used to extract all that those little pieces of copper ore that were left. And with this building, they were running at about 92% efficiency. That, even by today's standards, is unheard of. There were some years where they made $32 million in that year alone.
By 1916, the price of copper was climbing, and these mines were running around the clock, 3 shifts, trying to get as much copper out of these mountains and into the ships and onto market as they could.
Yet Kennicott's fortunes were tied to the global market, and with the Great Depression came plummeting copper prices. In 1938, management prepared to shut down operations.
The management knew that things were probably going to end up closing down in the foreseeable future, but they didn't tell the men that because they were afraid if they started warning people that things were going to start closing down, work production would start to decline. So to try to maximize the amount of work they could get out of these men, they didn't tell them until 24 hours before that last train was going to leave. If you were not on that train, you were going to get left behind.
Almost overnight, this place became a ghost town. Today, Kennecott lives on through hiking trails and guided tours, which preserves its enduring legacy.
All that copper that was produced here was used to create copper wiring, to electrify the East Coast, shell casings during the World War. Very crucial impact on the United States and the world.
On Scotland's Shetland Isles is a place that time forgot twice.
As you approach these islands from the south, you can see the remnants of a very large stone building. It's reminiscent of a castle, but that's not even the half of it.
The stone walls suggest a structure that's hundreds of years old, but at its feet is something far older.
You wind up in these circular rooms, all made out of blocks piled up precariously, but there's no mortar in use here. And it feels as if you knock one stone over, that the whole thing's gonna come crumbling down around you.
They really blend into the earth. They are part of the land. It's a very organic form of building, and it really stands out.
The mixture of the old and the ancient suggests this place had a long history. But one more clue might reveal how it became abandoned.
Slightly further away from the main building are these shallow channels cut into the ground.
Inside the smallest remains lies the answer to this mystery, and it's a story of greed and bloodshed.
These men were highly advanced, they were pushing the limits of the known world, and they could be extremely violent.
Archaeologist Dr. Val Turner knows the legend of this ruin's unscrupulous former owner.
This is the Laird's house, and it became the home or the possession of Patrick Stewart, who was the Earl of Orkney and Shetland.
Patrick was the son of Robert Stewart, a man with connections.
He was the half-brother of a queen with one of the most tumultuous reigns in history, Mary Queen of Scots.
Because the lairds here in Shetland were so far from royal authority, their power was untrammeled. And that meant when they got out of line, there was nobody to discipline them. And these guys got out of line.
Patrick ruthlessly exploited this power and freedom.
And as Lord of Shetland, he was notorious for being barbarous, rapacious, womanizing, intimidating, letting off criminals and murderers. He found the perfect spot to build a monument to his conquest, to mark his spot.
I think his quality of life would have been very good because, I mean, we see it as bare walls, but it would have had ornate paintings, hangings, tapestries. It would have been quite cozy and warm. And of course, he would have had servants and people working for him as well.
But in the late 19th century, it emerged that the Laird wasn't the first person to recognize the value of this bay.
In 1897, there was a huge storm, and it lashed away at the edge of the coast. And a few days later, somebody walking along the shore noticed that there were the edges of what looked like buried buildings poking out.
The storm uncovered dwellings that predated the Laird's house by at least 1,000 years. They were arranged in a circular pattern and made of layered stone.
But they also partitioned these houses into a number of cells or rooms. And the local people would have taken refuge in these wheelhouses from the harsh weather coming off of the sea, possibly from their harsh neighbors, and it would have created a feeling of community.
The wheelhouses were built by early settlers of Shetland known as the Picts.
The Picts were a native Celtic tribe from the Iron Age who managed to make the journey all the way from mainland Scotland to the Shetland Islands. That kind of journey would take a tremendous strength of will and a tremendous strength of arms.
It's 100 miles to the nearest mainland, and it's pretty much a one-way journey. Because the way the currents work, once you get here, it's going to be almost impossible for you to get back to the mainland.
Evidence of even earlier structures suggests that defense had long been a priority on these rugged islands.
So this is the base of a massive tower, and while that's the inner face, just wait till you see where the outer face is. There's this cell, which is in between the two walls, and the outer face is right here. So all of that is the base of the broch.
2,000 years ago, this tower stood 40 feet tall. It had 4 levels for people, animals, and a central hearth. It was one of hundreds that lined the Shetland coastline. A few still survive intact.
All over the north of Scotland and the Isles, there are these towers called brochs. You can keep your children safe, your babies safe from other tribes, and you can sleep in comfort knowing that nobody's going to sneak up and cut your throat in the night.
But a new threat would soon come across the stormy seas to Shetland. 1,000 years ago, strangers landed on the shoreline.
Britain has had a long history of invasion, but these men were a special breed of professional plunderers. They were highly skilled, had complete mastery over the sea.
These invaders were Vikings.
When the Vikings arrived in this part of the Shetland Islands, it's possible that the Picts were still here, still living in their traditional wheelhouses. But Vikings did things differently.
The Viking longhouses are rectangular. The area here is where people lived, and there were benches on either side of the living, feasting area, which people would have sat on in the day, but then at night there would have been skins on the benches, and they would have been where people slept as well.
If we look at the foundations of this longhouse, it reminds us of Beowulf, where Hrothgar lived with his sword thanes. It reminds us of a smoky night where Grendel creeps in through the door.
This wasn't just one hut. This was a settlement, one of hundreds that would lead to the Vikings conquering 2/3 of Britain.
So using these incredible longships and their navigational skills, they actually traveled as far as the coast of North America. They also raided and eventually settled all along the coasts of Western Europe. And then they traveled up the rivers as far as Moscow.
We don't know what happened to the native population of Shetland when the Norse came. It could be that instead of keeping the locals as slaves or marrying the local population, it could be they killed them all.
The last excavation of Jarlshof took place in the 1950s. Since then, it has become one of Shetland's most cherished artifacts. But the fate of the native Picts remains a mystery.
So what happened to the Vikings here in the Shetland Islands? In some ways, they never went away.
The Viking Norse were happy to leave behind their descendants, who still live there as proud descendants of Vikings today.
And people feel a very strong affinity with Vikings, and of course there's a big Viking festival in Shetland every January.
At this fire festival, Shetlanders take to the streets with flaming torches and burn a Viking longboat. And Jarlshof remains the most extensive Norse site visible in Britain today. High in the Swiss mountains sits a pretty alpine village. But for those in on the secret, it's anything but.
The Swiss Alps are beautiful. It's lush, it's manicured.
You wander across a meadow here and you see what look like totally innocuous little cottages.
They could be summer huts, they could be storage barns for farming and so on.
The reality, though, is something completely unexpected.
So this isn't just a hut or an animal shelter. This is actually a camouflaged cannon, 10.5 centimeter cannon. They can turn 360 degrees to be able to shoot down into the valley or all the way around. And there's 4 of these in the village up here.
The little kind of hut, it's just there for disguise. It's for display purposes only, and underneath there is a serious amount of weaponry.
You start to realize, no, This is not your average bucolic Swiss pasture. This is a killing field.
Someone's taken a lot of time to hide this military site.
This hidden emplacement is just the tip of the iceberg. Another innocuous-looking building nearby conceals an even bigger surprise and explains the real reason behind the disguises.
This isn't a barn. This is actually a bunker, a concrete bunker that's part of the fortress.
One of the largest fortresses ever built in Switzerland is right here, masterfully hidden from view.
Behind the set dressing of the cottages and the stable blocks inside the mountain, that's where the action is.
They've dug the fortress into the solid mountains. We're talking about 5 miles of tunnels. It could hold around 500 troops.
Basically 2 stories of fortifications built into the side of a mountain with 60 feet of rock between the lower story and the upper story.
This is Fortress Fergels, a battleship hidden inside the belly of a mountain. Built from 1939, this was Switzerland's response to an increasingly volatile Europe.
This thing is not just a fort, it's an ensemble of facilities. You've got the fortifications, you've got rooms for storage of munitions, you've got barracks for the garrison.
Dr. Erich Breitenmoser is now the fort's proud owner and enjoys showing off its incredible array of facilities and weaponry.
Here we are in the sleeping quarters for the soldiers. This room and the one next door would house 120 soldiers for sleeping.
Troops could live here completely shut off from the outside world for as long as 6 months.
And of course, no fort is complete without a good armament, and this place was bristling with good guns.
We have 4 10.5 centimeter guns, which are up in the village. And then we have 4 15 centimeter guns. It was the most heavily armed fortress in Switzerland. They would tell you, how to set up the gun and then give commander to shoot. Ready, shoot. And the guy would pull the thing over there, boom, shot would go off. In fact, the whole mountain shook like an earthquake when they shot the gun.
Trained soldiers would use manuals and instruments to expertly calculate the trajectory of the shell. But back in the day, it was far from an exact science.
They always waited until the call came back of where they hit the target to see how accurate they were. One day, a radio message came back, so they waited. So then a phone call came in from Liechtenstein in the town of Malboon. They said there was a bomb that hit right in front of the village. What happened? So obviously somebody made a mistake, so they found out that the fellow here did the wrong calculations, and we almost had war with Liechtenstein.
Swiss neutrality is legendary, but what distinguishes Switzerland from other neutral countries is Switzerland's policy of armed neutrality, meaning, don't mess with us.
But in the early 1940s, 2 of Europe's dictators were planning to carve up the country and share the spoils.
Early in World War II, Italian dictator Mussolini and German dictator Hitler actually concocted a plan, Operation Tannenbaum, or Christmas Tree, in which Italian forces would invade Switzerland from the south, German forces from the north. They would partition the country between them.
The fort was a crucial link in Switzerland's national fortification chain, built in anticipation of an Axis invasion.
Switzerland had sort of decided early on that it was going to use its geography as a key part of its defence. They were going to retreat into the mountains to sort of hidden fortresses, and that was like the ultimate defence of the country.
But as a neutral country, building a heavily armed fort of this size was treading a fine line.
They're not supposed to be doing any military engineering, but what they do is carry it out very, very quietly.
This place was very secret. In fact, I've known people who worked here, They wouldn't be able to tell their wives where they went to work.
This wasn't the only reason for secrecy, though.
An important factor as well about this place was you could catch the enemy by surprise. If your guns are hidden in the mountains, then all of a sudden there's massive firepower that they weren't expecting.
There's no better example of how the Swiss planned to control the only serviceable routes through the country with fortifications than this one.
They can see the Germans coming up from the Rhine Valley down there, from Austria, Lake of Constance, or from this side here, from the San Bernardino mountain pass from Italy. So they would be protecting this whole area here from them being able to go towards Zurich over there.
These hidden mountain forts were Switzerland's ace up their sleeve, but they had other cards to play too.
They also had the entire population armed for battle. In the event that the Germans or Italians invaded, all Swiss males were armed and trained with rifles, and they would turn out to defend their country.
Once the Second World War ended and Switzerland survived unscathed, they didn't reveal or even disarm Fort Furgels. Their attention instead turned to a new and potentially even more destructive menace.
The Cold War immediately springs up, so all of these World War II era forts were maintained and upgraded for the event of a Soviet invasion.
The fortress itself was then adapted with nuclear filters and so on.
And the unique position of the fortress made it an ideal nuclear shelter.
You have to be able to live here and independently. That means you can't be depending on a water line coming from someplace, because it can cut the water off. So they had their own spring in the mountain that fed these tanks.
The Swiss took this nuclear threat so seriously that Fort Furgels was still top secret in the 21st century, well after the Cold War had ended.
The fortress was decommissioned in 2002, and the secret that was hidden beneath this village could be finally revealed.
With declassification, the fort lost its military significance. But just before it closed down, one final shot was fired.
And the last time it was ever used, one of the cannons was actually fired off to get rid of avalanches.
Today, the fort is occasionally opened up for small groups to explore these fascinating relics.
Nowadays, you can wander around and you can see the barracks and the field hospital and the ammo storage rooms, and you can see the cannons in their turrets.
The constant cold temperature here now attracts new and interesting tenants.
A lot of people are inquiring about rooms like this for storage. Wine, we have great wine storage. Cheese, I had a guy here for cheese storage.
Fortress Furgels' purpose evolved to match Switzerland's perception of what posed the greatest threat. A peaceful Furgels, full of wine and cheese, is good news for everyone.